Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Bohrer, and I'm an Associate Provost and Dean of Public Policy Programs at Gettysburg College. Welcome to the first event in the Eisenhower Institute's new live series, which we will broadcast on Facebook on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Our goal is to look at ways of thinking about how challenges facing us today and the lessons we can learn from the legacy of President Eisenhower. I'm joined today by Susan Eisenhower, the founder of the Eisenhower Institute. Susan leads the Institute's Strategy and Leadership in Transformational Times program. Commonly known as SALT, this seminar uses case studies from contemporary geopolitics, history, and public policy to examine the tenets of strategic thinking in our rapidly changing environments. An author of many books, Susan's most recent publication, How Ike Led, is set to come out in mid-August. This biography of her grandfather explores the principles behind Dwight Eisenhower's greatest decisions regarding circumstances such as World War II, Little Rock, and the Cold War. We'll be talking today about her grandfather's leadership. We'll also be taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please share it with us through the comments. Welcome, Susan, and how are you adjusting to this new situation?
Well, actually, I think I'm adjusting, I'm happy to say, and I have to say that I've been writing or working from home off and on over the years, but this is new because we can't go out and we really do have to stay where we've been assigned to be. But I have to say that many mornings I wake up with such a sense of gratitude. I mean, how lucky we are to have a wonderful community like Gettysburg College that we can be communicating with all day long, and our colleagues beyond our institutions. And for me, it's an enormous honor and privilege to have a group of students at Gettysburg College called SALT, as you mentioned, Strategy and Leadership in Transformational Times. And so I feel so fortunate. And I'd just like to take this opportunity actually to thank all the people who work in the medical field and everyone in the service sector for really making it possible for this kind of quarantine to go on, because I think it's going to make a very big and positive difference.
Yes, I agree. Susan, throughout his career, Dwight Eisenhower repeatedly faced situations in which high-stakes decisions had to be made with limited information. Can you talk a bit about how he approached those decisions?
Well, I have to tell you kind of a funny story. Once, many years ago, Ike was supposed to speak at the University of Pennsylvania at a convocation, and the weather was looking iffy. The event was supposed to take place outside of, out on the football field, and the weather was looking iffy. So his brother Milton says, "Ike, do you think we should have this meeting outside, or should we bring it into the field house, which would, require a number of people being turned away?" And Ike looks up from his eggs, drinks a sip of coffee, and says, "Listen, Milton, I haven't worried about the weather since June 6, 1944. It's a rather wonderful story because I think one of his attitudes was, don't sweat the small stuff. And that would have been one of the small stuff, what to do about an event. Actually, June 6, 1944 was the big moment. This was the decision to launch the invasion of the French coast. We know it as D-Day. And it was an extraordinarily complex decision because of the weather and some, other developments that were underway, including a German division that was moving into the area. It was the largest joint military operation in history. And it's still an iconic event. So there were many decisions he had to make, but if you would allow me, let me just make 4 quick points on this. First of all, I think he was very good at questioning the assumptions that he had inside himself. He knew his own default position. So he liked, even though it could be aggravating at times, to surround himself with people who knew their field, but had differing opinions. So he liked to really test the assumptions. Next, he was, it was extraordinarily important to identify the key elements of the operation, which pieces of it were fundamental to the overall success of the operation. And then he was a great proponent of planning, and this means planning absolutely everything. If you look at the original documents for Operation Neptune, which was the naval segment of the Operation Overlord, or the D-Day decision. You just can't even believe the amount of detail that they went into, fully understanding that when they landed on those shores, they would probably have to improvise. But at least in the planning process, they could figure out and work through every one of those potential problems. And finally, which I think is the part that's become rather legendary, was his natural inclination to take full accountability for the outcome of the invasion, even though the one thing he couldn't control, that would be the weather, was something he was ready to take responsibility for. Why? Because it was his decision to go at that time, at that place, and under those weather conditions. And so in my book, I, of course, go through that story in much greater, more colorful detail. But I was surprised in the writing of this book how many other really consequential decisions he had to make in the course of his presidency.
Yeah. Thank you. Susan, as you know, this is not the first time a pandemic is affecting Gettysburg. Can you discuss Eisenhower's involvement when he was in charge of Camp Colt during the Spanish influenza outbreak?
Well, for anybody who knows Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, it's very curious. As you drive out Route 15 towards Emmitsburg, there's a very tall pine tree to the left if you're leaving from Gettysburg. And that pine tree was actually planted to mark the location of Camp Colt, which was the tank training facility that Dwight Eisenhower was commanding in 1917, 1918. I mean, it was only a year's engagement, more or less. But the point was, this was during World War I, not World War II. So at age 27, Ike becomes the commander of this tank corps. They start out with a few people. They quickly move to 500 soldiers that he is commanding, and in a very short time, scaled all the way up to 10,000 men. Now, as you can well imagine, they didn't exactly have everything that was necessary for training. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have any tanks. So I would say that the thing that impressed me most about this story was Ike's early ability to improvise. And I think that we're finding that today with this crisis, is the necessity for improvisation, because there's so many things we don't know about the coronavirus, just as we didn't know about the pandemic in 1918. As he was trying to train 10,000 men in tank maneuvers, sometime that fall, a number of soldiers came to the camp who were not feeling well, and it was thought that they were sick because of inoculations that they'd just been given. But they had the Spanish flu, and in a week, it tore through the camp. In a week, 175 people had died. And Ike had to not only organize that whole thing on the fly, but also to use his diplomatic skills to interact with the locals in town, who were not only terrified of this going on their border, but had to open up their church basements and other things to be impromptu hospitals. In any case, it turns out that Camp Colt was one of the great successes in the Army. And Ike, at age 28, received the Distinguished Service Medal for his leadership at Camp Colt.
Thank you.
It's quite a story. It's really quite a story. And I don't think most people going to Gettysburg actually even realize that something that important took place there.
Yeah, and I also think there's a lesson there. He was disappointed not to be in Europe during the war, but he really made the most out of that. And his command and leadership really, and then those lessons with the armored really paid forward in World War II.
Well, it sure did. And I think the thing that was very interesting about this improvisation is that they didn't even have any tanks. So he devised a system where they could learn how to shoot from a moving vehicle, which would be otherwise known as a truck. Finally, just about the time they went to deploy to go to France, a few French tanks turned up, but not enough time for everybody to train on them. So they were doing a lot on the fly. And it's interesting that Ike's command of Camp Colt during the influenza epidemic was seen as one of the cases of best practices in the Army, which is why he was later recognized for that.
Yeah. Susan, as you were conducting research for your book, while the subject matter is obviously very familiar on some levels, was there anything that struck you about your grandfather that maybe you didn't fully appreciate before?
Well, I think I've said this to Gettysburg audiences before. Many people know that I knew him well. I was about 17 when he died and spent a considerable amount of time, on the farm there in Gettysburg with them because we lived on an adjacent property. And I must say that he was extremely even. I think in writing this book, I'm just astonished what was going on in certain years when he even managed to come to one of my riding lessons or a horse show or my sister's ballet lessons. He was very, very good about managing stress. He did an excellent job of that. And I was really surprised in a way about how hard and fast certain crises arose. Now, he was very well schooled in making extremely tough decisions. And I think he benefited a lot from developing over the course of his long career, and a deep and abiding philosophy about his place as the events unfolded. He was really had quite a selfless view of things, which may seem extraordinarily old-fashioned, but we have to recognize that the military itself are an extraordinary band of people who have committed themselves to putting others, the country first. And that kind of sense of self-sacrifice came through to me pretty loud and clear in the course of this research.
Yeah. Susan, you yourself have had a lot of experiences in times of crisis. Could you share with us what you've learned from your experiences in different times of crises?
I was thinking about that as I was researching the book too. Everything from where I was on 9/11 next to the White House when the White House evacuated in a state of panic, but probably the most important things that I experienced along the way were things that stayed with me always. First of all, I was living in Great Britain in the 1970s. And at that time, the Irish Republican Army was on a rampage in London with a bombing campaign that left almost no iconic spot unbombed. And there were car bombs going off all over the place. While I was living there, there was a bombing of my local grocery store and environs. And, you woke up in the morning, I had two little kids, and you woke up in the morning, you thought, wow, I wonder what's going to happen today. But boy, did I see the British spirit. And I could, when I say could see the spirit, I'm talking about the World War II spirit. The Brits got on and got out there, and as they always say, stay calm and carry on. And I saw it in spades. And then during the same period, we had a coal miners' strike that went on for 3 different winters with no electricity for 3, 6, or 9 hours a day. So you can imagine trying to run a business in the dark like that. And it was a very, very trying time. Then I guess the other big experience, I should say rather quickly, is that I was an analyst and a writer and a think tanker during the years leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think one of the things that is not well understood about Russia today is that terrible experience, especially in the early 90s. So while I was spending lots of time in that country between 1986 and 1999, can you imagine that in 1991, 2, that inflation in New Russia was 3,000% a year? Yeah. So money had no meaning. People could barely survive. They had to lock up their pets because people were stealing them and eating them. I mean, the level of desperation was extraordinary. And yet I never saw so much resilience and frankly, so much creativity. And so that whole idea of stay calm and carry on and resilience and creativity, I think are things that could, that bode well even as we think about our current situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Susan, this time we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I have one, and that is, what advice would you give for our graduating seniors for Gettysburg College graduates? Certainly unprecedented times for them as well.
It is, I think nothing has stayed with me more than the idea that the graduating seniors are going to miss the opportunity for so many of the traditions that are associated with the college, and so many of the wonderful opportunities to connect with and reconnect and make plans for the future with their fellow classmates. But this is what I would say to them. I mean, you are living in historic times now, and don't ever forget it. I mean, those things I just outlined have stayed with me always. And you're making a kind of sacrifice for your country by following the demands, let's put it that way, of the people in charge, that we try and preserve our medical facilities as best we can as we go through this. And so feel good about that, but then also try and make up for it when things have eased. You know, have a wonderful reunion, or have that party you were always going to have. So do stay in touch with your classmates, because it is possible to come back and not only relive your college experience, but relive the experience you're having right now.
Yeah, that's great advice. Susan, a question there. There have been some arguments and that have been made that during the current crisis, Americans have been overloaded with information from traditional news media and social media. And I know you yourself have a background in journalism, but do you think it's important to balance our intake of information on a daily basis?
Well, let's put it this way, Rob. You asked me at the beginning of this conversation how I was doing under the circumstances, and I would say I had a really rough time for about 2 weeks. Now, I've always dreamed of taking the phone off the hook and having time to think, but everybody was scrambling and everybody was trying to figure out what happened. And then I had the tragic experience of, it wasn't my experience, I should say, the tragic moment to find out that one of my dear friends and colleagues and a great friend of our Normandy program, Carol Brookins, died of coronavirus. I mean, I'm still, you know, just dazed and shattered by it. And so for about 2 or 3 weeks, I was sort of bumping around. But now I realize that what we have to do is to manage this the same way we tried to manage our other life. And what I would say about that is I've now decided that I'm spending the mornings quietly working on writing projects, returning emails and the rest of it. And then I'll talk in the afternoon. But what wasn't working for me was combining the two, because really being on, you know, Zoom gatherings and the rest of it I guess they use a different side of your brain or something, but I just wasn't being very productive. And I'm feeling better as a person now that I feel like I'm actually making some progress.
Thanks, that's great. We have another question here. It's some say that government relief from the pandemic and academic fallout should be strictly aid. Others are trying to get adjacent goals like mail voting or tax breaks accomplished in the relief package. Do you think that Ike would have been an advocate for only an aid relief package, or would he have taken the opportunity, the circumstances to accomplish other goals?
Oh, I think he would have focused on the crisis. But then my father always used to say, please don't try and speculate on what your grandfather would do under a completely different set of circumstances. I know he'd be looking at, see, this crisis right now not only undermines the public health of ordinary Americans in every state in the union, our economy is taking an extremely big hit right now. I think I can say with some confidence that he would have had a strategy for how to manage the reintroduction of our business life in this country. I have not seen it coming from either side of Pennsylvania Avenue, and it worries me a lot that we haven't articulated to the American people, A, what victory looks like, and B, to give us a goal to work towards. Flattening the curve is a great idea, but what does a flat curve look like, and when is the curve flat enough so that we can look at phase 2 and phase 3? So I think he clearly would have looked at it like a strategist, because he was a great strategist. And I think this is a real gap right now in our public policy and our public discourse. There's a great piece in the New York Times today from somebody who is outlining his ideas of how that would work. And, I almost logged on and left a love letter. We're so desperate to know. And then if I may say one more thing, Rob, I was really, really moved by the fact that the British asked for volunteers. I don't know if you've been following this.
Yes.
The National Healthcare System put out a word that they'd like to have some volunteers to help ease the way for the most vulnerable in their society. 750,000 people signed up, 3 times more than they were expecting. Now that's the British spirit I knew and loved and always have loved. And I just wish that our public policy officials would give us a goal like that, help mobilize us. That's how we got through World War II. Everybody had a job. Everybody had something to do. Everybody was a piece of making this happen. And while we're doing our duty by staying home, there's more we could do from our homes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Susan, have you seen any examples of leaders that have emerged during this crisis that have a leadership style that you found positive, remarkable? Perhaps it reminds you likes, maybe not, but just any leaders that stand out to you, or actions like the British government's actions, anything in the United States, governors?
Well, I think I will avoid making comments about the people we've known for a long time. Those are the people up on Capitol Hill. I think you're seeing some amazing things coming out of the state governors. And there's a lot of discussion about Andrew Cuomo, the way he has stepped up to this plate. I say that on a nonpartisan basis. I'm sure most Americans can look at the governor's actions and be impressed by the fact that he knew what he wanted to accomplish. And he has been in a reasoned dialogue with the citizens in New York. My older sister, Anne, lives in New York City. And, I think she has found it very, very helpful to have that governor so direct and forthright from the people of the city. You see other examples of that in other states. And I think this is going to be extremely interesting later after this crisis is over. The differences between the way the states managed this crisis and what is now seen to be the federal government standing back from what many people would have thought was a traditional responsibility beyond just economic stimulus.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan. And I think we'll call it a wrap. One of the things you mentioned, Zoom, and some of the issues, I've noticed that people tend to have increasingly short attention spans because we are bombarded with information. But this has been fantastic, and I wanted to thank you for your thoughtful answers here, and to let our viewers know, thank them for tuning in, and we hope that they'll join us next week. There will be a town hall with the Eisenhower Institute undergraduate fellows, where they will explore the current state of the military-industrial complex. And so thank you, Susan, and thank you all for tuning in, and stay safe and be healthy. And thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Rob.